Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this very nice event. I'm happy to be back with Scienza Virgola, with our, which we have been collaborating with our sister organization, CISA, for many years. And I think today is also, this year is the centennial year of the founding director of ICTP, the International Center for Theoretical Physics, which later came to be known as the Abdus Salam International Center for Theoretical Physics. And this is 2026 is the 100th anniversary of Abdus Salam. So I think it's a very nice occasion for us to be participating in this. And I'm happy to introduce today's poet. I have not read her poetry, but I look forward to learning about it today. But I do know that she's an ecologist by training. She started her life as an ecologist, and in that avatar, she has been to ICTP several times, as I understand. So she does have a very strong connection with ICTP, and now she is in the new, in this new role as a poetess or poet. And I look forward to listening about her poetry. And it's an interesting, I think it's a very good idea to combine science and art, I mean, which are sometimes often thought to be like poles apart, but actually that's not the case. There is a certain sources of creativity which are common to both, I would say. And so it would be interesting to hear how a scientist has turned into a poet. I know that, for example, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, when it was founded, Oppenheimer was the director. Actually, Oppenheimer was also the first chair of our scientific council. And the idea of the Institute for Advanced Study was indeed this, that you would have great science and great art done under the same roof. So if I remember correctly, T.S. Eliot was was one of the members, together with people like Einstein and von Neumann and Gödel. So I look forward to today's intervention. Thank you.
Start with your voice. We start with directly with the poetic voice of Madhur, please. What we don't see in light's dark reactions. The rejection of reds, a gap of blues, chlorophyll absorbing necessary wavelengths. The public good of peacocks, feather primordia morphogenesis behind the wheel. Function and shine of an evening brooch, butterflied, shiver and heat, sky scraping violet, Brazilian soccer shirts and cachaça on ice, birds of paradise peering through closed canopy, flowers like heliconia mistaken for flight, fancy, economy, monkeys and mycorrhiza playing non-zero sum games, giant seed pods like maracas, chandeliers dimmed, everything instrumental, quiet breaths exchanged by the carbon pool, oranges crushed, too easily spent, green going underground, tropical bonds, shape-shifting mouths, nameless and innumerable, moving iron-rich soil, liberating minerals and death. Liana hanging, black, green, red, a parting of leaves, something winged, ringed molecules, sugar from light. So we decided to start with Madhur's voice, because the issue of voice in her poetry and in her thought in general is so important and so crucial. But as you have just heard, there are so many other things that intertwine in this poetry. And the first intertwining is, of course, poetry, art, and science, which is, in a sense, something that surprises many people, but it shouldn't be so surprising because, as you said before, they can live together, they should live together. This morning we had a talk with some brilliant students, a dialogue at Induino, and I asked the same question just to start to Madhur. I asked her, what happened when you started as a scientist to think that you could write poetry, that you could engage with art and creativity, which is not just, discovering things through science and data and numbers and so on and so forth. And what you said this morning is that for you, the thing that science and poetry have in common is precisely discovery. And also you said something about the fact that both science and poetry engage with the unknown, so that it's not something that we already have, but they really manage to say something about what we don't know, what we don't see, what we do not hear, what we are not able to listen. So I would like to start from this, but before I have to tell you something about what we are talking about. So today we are talking about two books of poetry. The first one is this new index for predicting catastrophes, which was published in 2015. And then the more recent one is Parasitic Oscillations. It was published in 2022. But Madhur Anand is also the author of a memoir, this one, The Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart, which was published in 2020, thank you. This is very, very recent. This is 2025. Mm-hmm. So this is a novel, actually, to place a rabbit, and this is actually a novel. So we are talking about your poetry today, this idea of discovery and the unknown, but there's a lot more to read and to talk about. But let's concentrate on poetry and this kind of discovery tonight. Please tell us something about that.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Yeah, I think I'll tell this story of, again, because I think it's a different audience now, and it's a question I get asked every time, which is, when did you start writing poetry? And in fact, I think you just asked me that. Which came first? And I mean, in the end, the answer is I don't believe in a first and second, actually, with these types of things anymore. However, the way that life goes, we are actually a bit forced to choose a little bit when we go through our institutions. And so I wrote my first poem only in the final year of finishing up my PhD thesis. So, I had never really thought about poetry. I was never asked to write a poem for whatever reason. I wasn't in classes or courses where that was asked. I didn't have anybody around me who was doing that kind of thing. So for whatever reasons, it arrived a bit later, and then what happened was I was working on my thesis. I'm a theoretical ecologist, so I was actually using a lot of ideas from theoretical physics and applying them to study complex ecological dynamics. I was working on applications of information theory to quantify diversity and complexity. So maybe we'll come around to Boltzmann at some point, but because my next project involves Duino, so those were my topics. And one day, I just could not move further with working on my thesis, and In retrospect, I call it scientist block. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of writer's block, but this was, I thought, scientist block. And I just couldn't articulate. I couldn't move forward. And I left my desk, my computer, the lab. I was alone. I walked over and looked out the window. The view was a single horse chestnut tree in flowering. And I came back to my desk and I wrote my first poem. And in the sort of days that were following, I wrote a few more. And that's how it started. And I can't really say, I mean, I now try to think about, well, what were the conditions that gave rise to that? And it was many things. It was many things which I think actually contribute to writing and still do, which is a lot of time alone in solitude, not necessarily alone, but alone in one's thoughts. And then I think really what it was a feeling that where I was about to defend my thesis. So it was the end of a very long process of, being completely immersed in something and being expected to be sure of something and to present a final result and to be an expert in this very small sliver of knowledge or discovery, and at the same time being at the point where perhaps I alone knew just how much was not known about that sliver of knowledge, because of when you do research in science, you know what you have ignored or what you have discovered is yet to be discovered, and there's so many questions around what you finally present that it's just a very strange state of in which I felt very difficult to articulate what I knew because of what I did not know, because of what I knew of what I didn't know. So I think it was something like that, and I think that now because that is a little bit where poetry reemerges in my life at different points, at that edge of knowing and not knowing. And so that was a cusp moment, a threshold moment, and that's when it started. So then, but then to, go to the stage of publishing books is a much longer process. And so I mentioned that, what I really had was curiosity about many things, and including poetry itself suddenly. And so I was very curious what was going on, what I was doing, what poetry was, and I, proceeded to then read and learn about it, and found, was pretty much, astounded by finding scientific ideas in books of poetry, when the poets didn't necessarily have that background or intention. So I discovered the feeling of what it means to read a poem, really, because that is the experience of reading poetry, is not that there's some intention in the poem, it's really what you see in it, what you bring, and therefore what you see, so the lenses. And but it still shocked me, that moment of interaction with a poem and realizing that I was seeing something in it that related to my research, even that things about complex systems and how they behave, scales, fractals, different types of ideas and structures and processes. So that, and then I worked on once I felt that, and then I had the desire to improve my poems, basically, because I saw the big gap between what I was reading and what I was doing, and I thought, okay, how do I go from here to there? And I had to find my own way, but essentially I started to learn the craft of poetry and found my voice that way.
And you mentioned this morning that you tried to get access to other examples of poetry. For example, you mentioned Szymborska and other contemporary Canadian poets. So what struck me also in your description now is that you felt like an outsider. That's what we were... You can't hear? Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, sorry, thank you for... So in your description of how you got to become a poet, let's say, you describe yourself as an outsider, as someone who comes from outside the field. And this gives you this specific perspective of estrangement, which is very, very fruitful, very, very productive, very stimulating. And at the same time, what you managed in these extraordinary books, because these are really, really very, very interesting books, and I suggest you read that definitely. So what you manage to convey through your poetry is exactly this idea of complexity. So there are multifarious, there are many levels, there are many, many things that interact and intertwine, also personal, historical, the relationship between generations and the visual, the sound, the voice, the human, the non-human. And so all these things manage to coexist in your work. But this idea, this central idea, which is your topic of research, which is complexity, is definitely present here and set to work. So I would like you to tell us something about these two very complex concepts and notions that are at the center of both books. In the first case, we have this idea of prediction, not only catastrophes that might catch our attention first, but this idea of predicting, because science is supposed to predict what happens next. Whereas poetry is not required to do that. So this is a problem. How do we posit ourselves in relation to this idea of the possibility of predicting the future? And the other idea, which is even more maybe obscure for people outside the field, of parasitic oscillations, which is a very specific concept regarding the production of bird sounds. But at the same time, it is a highly, highly poetic and artistic notion that is at the center of this book. So I would like you to tell us something on the way in which you managed to put these scientific topics and problems inside poetry and make them something really, really complex and fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the title, A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes, it came from, it's actually a line in one of the poems in the book, but it did come from the fact that I was working on some methods for detection of tipping points in ecosystems. And so, I mean, that was just something that I, that we scientists try to do. It's one of the things that we are tasked with is prediction. But when we do modeling in ecology, it's not only about prediction. It's I mean, maybe in any field, right? It's and that's something that's I have to explain to like the general public, probably not all of you, but. A lot of what we do in modeling is like mechanistic understanding or like simulations of scenarios. And so it's a little bit like imagining, actually. So, yes, there's, of course, some interest, most of the time there is some interest in making predictions and then seeing if they will come about or whatever, or if they, but also it's about imagining like alternate trajectories. And So, all of those ideas. And so one particular method of predicting tipping points is something called early warning signals. I don't know if anybody knows about this, but it's kind of a statistical technique which looks at variance, and there's this notion of critical slowing down. That's the technical term, actually. The scientific technical term is critical slowing down. And if you see that kind of behavior in a time series, say, then you can predict the onset of a tipping point, a big shift in the regime of a system, regime shift. So anyway, these are things that we're doing, and anyway, I used it as a big metaphor, really, but it does occur to me that there is something about necessary, let's say, like I have given some thought to how that could relate to poetry itself and the production of poetry or the writing of poetry and of creativity. There is a point where you have to really just look carefully, observe, and notice things. And so there is a kind of critical slowing down involved in the process of writing poems too. But also more generally, like I said, it was sort of more of a metaphor, which is it's like a different way. So poetry itself is another way to examine our world, to analyze our world, to see things, to understand things, and that related more back to my own experience of discovering things in poems. So I know that poetry is not necessarily supposed to predict anything, but I do think there are things that we can learn from them, learn in a very broad sense. Of course, there are actually things you will learn in my poetry which are kind of more pedantic, like you will learn some scientific facts because they are embedded in some of them. But there's other things, and but I think that is very, dependent on the reader. So it's very, what is to be gained from reading poetry is an interaction, actually, that happens with the reader. And so, I think one of the interesting things that the outsider part is interesting because, I think many people find poetry difficult exactly because they are not poets, because they are coming as outsiders in a way, right? And sometimes you can't even enter the room of poetry, the stanza, and so that can be difficult, but I don't know, maybe, for me, I don't know, I did enter the room. I did want to enter the room, and so much so that I was like, I was looking for something. I was looking for something in poetry at that point in my life as well. And I found it there. And it's not because it was there to be found, So I feel like there is a kind of interaction in that process. So, And coming back to prediction, I wouldn't go so far as to say that poems can predict things, but they can make things happen.
Yeah. And also we can use, poetry and literary texts as kind of magical predictions.
They really do make things. It does for the writer, and I think also for the reader. I think also for the reader, because I think my poems came from other poems, so that's already one very simple relationship that is definitely universal. we don't. I could not start really writing poems until I started to read other poems, and I know that that's generally the case.
Yeah, it's
So.
quite evident in the practice of reading. Oops, sorry. Okay, this is quite evident in your writing, this idea of writing as a practice of reading and rewriting, and this cycle, continuous cycle, which is vital, of course, like in nature, in the environment. And another thing which is really evident in your writing is the respect you have for the specificity of poetry and writing. And what we were talking about this morning, this idea that there is a method in poetry, which is both a constraint and a freedom. And so maybe you can tell us something also about that, because you experiment with many genres and forms of writing. For example, the found poems, or some metrics form, which are very, very interesting and very well done, I can tell you. Quite perfect. And then the awareness that you gained of a specific pattern. You told us this morning that is something that you realized you were creating while writing. So that's very interesting to hear from you, how you work, how you entered, as you said, as an outsider, but you really managed to enter the specificity and the technicalities, too, of writing poems.
Yeah. I was saying that I think it was actually, I think, an advantage that I didn't have any training in poetry. I didn't really know anything about poetic form, meter, any of the language, any of the linguistics of poetry. I was not aware of. Like if someone had asked me, name a type of poetry, a form of poetry, maybe I would have said haiku, but I wouldn't have known anything more than that. And yet here I was saying to myself, I want to write poetry. So I didn't go and take a course. No, I really did approach it as an outsider, but as I said, I read. But the main thing was, finding my voice and, realizing that my voice was already laden with scientific language and culture and knowledge, because voice is in terms of, what I wanted to say, how I wanted to say it. And so I had to kind of allow myself to speak with that part of my voice, but also bring in all of the other things that I was not able to articulate with just that voice. And then I had to choose a form. I mean, I had to do something. So I started to write in what's called free verse. But I discovered very soon that the poems started to kind of have a certain shape on the page. And they roughly kind of had the same line length. And so one day I just started to count the syllables of each line and discovered that they were not that variable. There was not a lot of variability in the syllables, so it was like 11, 12, 13, 14, and it would just kind of oscillate around those numbers. But I was saying that I basically kind of made a sort of frequency diagram of the syllables that I was using in my lines, and I found that the majority of time it was 13 syllables. And so I started to, then I said to myself, well, what if I actually try to write in 13 syllable lines? So I would go back and I would try to see, okay, this one is 11, okay, I need 2 more syllables. So I was like fiddling with it, which, maybe doesn't sound like a big deal to you, but it's huge in poetry because it would then, for example, change where you would break a line, which is huge, and it can totally change, the poem. Or if I could not find a way to work with 13, like it just wasn't fitting, I would have to switch out a word or a phrase. And that question itself, like, putting that question to oneself is also huge in poetry, because every single word is chosen. So if I have to, substitute it or change it, it could just, the whole thing could fall apart, or I would have to find some way to revise it. So I was sort of, it was sort of a way that I actually discovered myself how to revise my own poems. And by imposing that constraint, which was already a bit natural in my voice. So that was just one thing that I discovered later, much later, a few years later, actually, after I had published this book. So several of the poems are written in syllabics. That's actually a form. That's a poetic form. There are poets who write in syllabics. There is a very well-known form of the French Alexandrine line, which is 12, actually, 12 syllables. But, I don't know. I don't think there exists one that has 13 syllables. That's my line. But yeah. So these are not. I'm following a poetic tradition without even quite realizing it. So, which just means that those traditions came from something quite natural about human voice, that we do have rhythm, and that's what poetry, rhythm and metrics are important to poetry, and I was just discovering that myself as an outsider. But then you can also, when you are an outsider, then you can also do things differently, right? And so that was the freedom that I felt I had as an outsider, and you can then, be inventive, and so there were some inventive forms as well.
Talking about inventive forms, this book, Parasitic Oscillations, is full of inventions and a mixture of verbal and visual, and it is actually a book about voice and sounds. And first of all, I would like you to tell us what are these parasitic oscillations, because it's not that so clear at the beginning, and then the various forms you used here, because we have poems, we have found poems, by the way, and we have these plans, face plane, portraits, and then we have pictures that are taken from hidden archives, part of museums and collections that are not exhibited openly. And then this brings us to also another part we haven't talked about yet, but I think it's very important. I appreciate it very much in your work, this idea of memory, of tradition, of the colonial archive as a multi-leveled legacy that is to be, of course, overturned and criticized, and at the same time you cannot get rid of it. So everything is here in this book, and I would like you to try to tell us a bit, but of course you have to read it to understand this complexity.
It really is difficult to talk about poetry, but so I'm just talking about the process, not actually the poems, because you have to just experience them. But I will tell you, let's say, how this book came about, or what were the questions I was pursuing, and what happened. So I became quite interested in a museum, a research collection of bird specimens that were and eggs, birds and eggs that were collected by Alan Octavian Hume in colonial times in India, and I mean, I think I was just fascinated with the objects, with collection. I saw these. So these are things that you wouldn't see as the public going into the museum. These are in the back research collections in drawers, and they're used, to to support our scientific understanding of biodiversity, and so yeah, he was collecting these in like the late 1800s, and these specimens still exist. You can go and see them. I mean, I think what interested me in it was because I do have a family, heritage from that part of the world, and so I was quite fascinated by, how things can persist over centuries in these collections, and the fact that they were stored in places outside of India, like in the UK, and some of the collection itself has been broken up and dispersed in different parts of the world, much like the Indian diaspora of people. So it was just sort of this interesting kind of diasporic dispersal of specimens in different places and through different processes, and but then in that, so that's where some of the photographs come from. They're photographs that I took of these specimens in the museums, and then I found them. I mean, they're dead birds, right? So I wanted to kind of bring them to life in a way through my poetry, but also just through their own voices. So there's little QR codes. I put QR codes on the photographs which point to their songs. They actually work. We'll point to their bird song. And then I became really, really interested in bird song, and started to look at what bird song is, which is, birds have a very special way of producing sound, which is very different from humans. We have larynxes, and birds have syrinxes. And syrinxes have chambers so that birds can produce more than one note simultaneously, 2 notes simultaneously. So that's partly why birdsong is so rich and complex. So then I was like, okay, well, what is song? It's basically just oscillations. It's waves. And so I was looking at these mathematical models of birdsong, and realizing that, in fact, some of those models had some functional forms and processes that were very similar to, they actually came from theoretical physics, and I was applying also to my ecological systems. So you see that, this approach, this lens, allows one to see universality between different types of systems, which is a feature of poetry that I love. And then, I came across this notion of parasitic oscillations because some of those models were also coming from an area of science called control theory, in which some kinds of oscillations, like parasitic oscillations, you try to dampen them. You try to remove them from the system because it's noise, and but in other systems, noise is very important, actually. So when I make some of my ecological models, noise is inevitable. Like, you cannot actually eliminate it. So you have to see, sometimes it can actually be well, I don't know, constructive in a system. So like the phenomena of stochastic resonance, for example. So these were all ideas that that entwined and informed the poetry, and that's sort of where this collection came from.
And also this idea of the voice we talked about also this morning. You were saying something, I don't know if you want to tell us again.
Yeah, sure.
About your personal relationship with voice in that particular moment of your life. But I think that voice is a problem at the center. Oh, if you
yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, well, I mean, both of my collections, like, do engage with, our. It's difficult to be an ecologist and do ecological modeling and not, be affected by the fact that we are in, ecological catastrophes and facing many of them. So that's something that and yet it's something that I cannot address very directly scientifically. So that's kind of one of the missing dimensions I find in poetry, that I can address a little bit with poetry. So that is an element, that you will kind of hear in the voice, in the poetic voice, that maybe is not present when you read my scientific papers. Yeah, and then in addition to that, of course, there's personal losses and things. So, between the first book and the second book, in the second book was a time when my mother was not well, and she was losing her voice, and so as I was trying to write about some aspects of my history, my family history and heritage, as I'm trying to reconstruct and maybe create some sort of signal for myself of that past, my mother was losing her voice. So then voice also becomes kind of important in that way, quite literally as well.
And its uniqueness, as you said, and singularity and linked to life, to vital aspects of the human and non-human. And something else that you will certainly find in these books is this idea, which is, of course, a problem for literature, for poetry, but in general for literature, the fact that this is a verbal art, and the humans communicate through words, but other beings do not have words. And so when literature tries to find this kind of general shared knowledge and possibility of communicating, literature comes at a point where it finds its limits, its absences. So what you cannot see, what you cannot do. So that's something that you engage with in a very, very interesting and profound way in your writing. And of course, I would like to ask you so many things, also more literary, more specifically literary, because, for example, we didn't mention him, I think, today, but Rilke is very important, and Rilke addressed this question specifically in many of his poems. And then there are many other references that I could maybe just imagine, maybe it was just my imagination, but I would like you to ask something about Adrien Rich, which is quoted here at the beginning of a new index for predicting catastrophes. And then let me ask you something, really an hypothesis, like, literary critics like to do this thing. So what's really struck me when I read this is the beginning of a novel, a very canonical novel of English literature, which is Jane Eyre. I don't know if you...
I've not even read it.
No, really?
But, yeah.
No? Okay. So, Jane Eyre at the beginning, so she's an orphan, she's in this family that really treats her very badly, and she tries to find her place in that big house, hostile house, and what she does is finding a book and putting herself near the window and opening this book and finding a connection through the nature which is outside, which is threatening because it's, everything that is dangerous outside. And what book is that? It's the Bewick, the History of English Birds. And she...
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's an illustrated book, and it has text and pictures. And I said, oh my God, because this is a very, important moment in the book. That's really the identity of the character. of the female character as a reader and as someone who tries to imagine something else, to discover something else. So there's really, really an interesting analogy with what you were saying. If you would like to tell us something about this, I mean, can I call it feminist perspective, which is also here,
Maybe.
quoting Adrian Rich, and maybe all the things that are there, and I see them maybe wasn't there actually.
I don't know. I don't know. But what I see from that scene that you've just described, which is fascinating, I had no idea, is something that I think is part of what I'm doing with my poetry too, which is this, like, so what I see from that scene that you have described is someone like considering the theory of something and the reality of something. You know, so the book about birds, and then the birds, maybe she can hear the birds. If there's trees, there's probably birds. So so it's that kind of, you know, clash of that. And I think that's something that, you know, I mean, maybe that was me. I didn't bring my thesis with me to the window, but maybe that's kind of what happened to me that day. You know, I brought my thesis and I'm modeling, you know, vegetation dynamics, and I'm looking out the window, and it's reminding me of something else too that I read, but and maybe it was from Rilke. But just this idea of, like, you know, theory and reality, and thinking and being, and you know,
this feeling also of being in a precarious situation, which is, you know, threatening environment that you try to make sense of. It's your poetry and your science are both ways of making sense of the world, of yourself in the world, and your relationship with what is around. I want to ask you something about your future projects, because maybe they're linked to Trieste, and if you want to tell us something, or
I'll try.
Yeah, please.
I'll try, but it's a long story. But I'll try to be short. And I mean, I came to Trieste for a workshop at ICTP in May of 2024, and someone at the workshop, it may have been Matteo, said, I was with my family, and he suggested that we take a trip to a nearby village to see a castle, that, my kids might like it. So we took the ferry from ICTP, we went to Duino, we walked into the castle, we were walking through the castle, looking at everything, and then I come into a room and I start to see the Rilke paraphernalia, and I discover that Rilke was there, and that he wrote Duino elegies, which I had not yet read, I had not heard of. I had read some Rilke, but not that. And then afterwards, another colleague suggested we walk along the trail. I'm an ecologist, so of course I wanted to do that. And at one point we stopped and rested and took in the view, and I pulled out the Duino elegies, and I was starting to read it for the first time there on the trail, and I found a line very soon in the first elegy that was, it is truly strange to no longer inhabit the earth. That particular translation wrote it that way, but I've now since seen many different translations. It is truly strange to no longer inhabit the earth. And I read that out loud and into the air, and I learned, maybe that then or soon after, about the story. Do you know the story of the Duino elegies and Rilke? What happened to him? He was visiting the castle, and he was walking along the cliffs, and he heard a voice in the wind, and what that voice said became the first lines of Duino elegies. Anyway, it was very potent moment, and I returned home. Nothing really happened except I didn't forget it. And a few weeks later, a friend of mine told me that that Boltzmann committed suicide, Edwino, the theoretical physicist. And it's when I heard that second thing, I realized that I felt like I wanted to think about it in a poetic way. I mean, well, what happened was I was like, I thought to myself, well, this is a site of, poetic creation and, scientific tragedy. So what is that? What is that confluence? What does that confluence mean? And I couldn't really find an answer for myself. I couldn't reconcile it. Somehow it was really, it was a question, an open question, and Boltzmann, of course, working in entropy, was related to my own research a little bit, and because we now in ecology, our measures of biodiversity come from entropy, actually. So I've been contemplating all of that and reading a lot of Rilke, reading his letters, because I actually find the Duino elegies very difficult to read. So I had to go around them, and I'm reading all his letters. Finally, I'm coming back to them, but after a long thing, I've read his novel. He wrote one auto-fictional novel. I've been reading a bit more about Boltzmann and his life, and I even found that they never met, because it was a very short period between when Rilke started Duino elegies. Rilke arrived about 6 years after Boltzmann, and they never met, although they could have, but they never did, because of just who Rilke was. He was speaking with many different people, many different disciplines, and so on, wrote letters to many people, but I couldn't find any evidence that they met or corresponded or had any interaction. But Rilke was reading, Darwin and so many things. There were huge advances happening in science, and he was aware of many of them. So anyway, I've been researching it all and reading about it, and I even found that Boltzmann wrote a poem. Yeah, he wrote a poem, and so anyway, I'm writing some poems. Let's see, I have this this poetic hypothesis that and I'm imagining that Rilke actually heard the voice of Boltzmann that day when he started to write Duino elegies. So that's my ideas around that, and I'm writing some poems.
So fascinating, and we are definitely looking forward to this reading. So, do you have any questions? Questions for, please.
Just curious about the novel.
Oh yes. So this is a novel that it's about, there's actually an abstract at the beginning. I wrote an abstract as part of the novel, as if it was, yeah. So I could read that for you if you want, because it would pretty much describe what happens in this novel. But it's a novel that plays with the idea of translation across arts and science, across languages, and across time. Because I think there's such a thing as translation across time. So a scientist possessing a newfound desire to write fiction meets a novelist at a literary festival whose most recent novella has been published only in French translation. The original English version was never published, and the novelist posits its virtual erasure as an act of conceptual performance art. Hearing this, the scientist, who reads and speaks French, is irresistibly moved to translate the French novella back into English. As her memories, theories, and queries begin to insert themselves into the translation process, making it come apart at the seams, the scientist discovers that the object of her desire is not the French novella she has promised to translate, but rather a French biologist who became her lover in the past. When the novelist is invited to return to the setting of her novella at the foot of the French Alps, the scientist decides to accompany her. There she meets individuals whose actions and speech she has been translating carefully because they are characters in the novella. She also reunites with her French lover for the first time in 20 years and begins to wonder about the power of translation to mitigate desire and of fiction to transform the course of reality. So that's what the novel is.
Yes, but to conclude, maybe we can pass to other questions later. We have a kind of special occasion here because I got to know this morning that a part of this book, right, was translated into Italian, so about translation. And so I have the pleasure and the honor to read you the poem that we heard from Madhur's voice at the beginning, What We Don't See in Light's Dark Reactions. So this is by Monica Boria, right? The translator is Monica Boria. Ciò che non vediamo nelle reazioni oscure della luce. Il rifiuto dei rossi, un vuoto di blu, la clorofilla che assorbe lunghezze d'onda necessarie, i pavoni come bene pubblico, morfogenesi di piume primordiale nella ruota, funzioni e splendori di farfalla in una spilla da sera, calore e fremiti, il viola che gratta il cielo, magliette del calcio carioca e caciassa con ghiaccio, la sterlizia che fa capolino dal bersò di foglie, i fiori dell'eliconia scambiati per stormo, sfarzoso, efficiente, scimmie e micorrize che fan giochi a somma non zero, baccelli giganti come maracas, luci soffuse, tutto strumentale, silenziosi sospiri scambiati ai bordi della piscina di carbonio, le arance al macero con fredda noncuranza, il verde che finisce sottoterra, titoli tropicali, bocche che mutano forma, innominabili e innumerevoli, smottamenti di suolo ferroso che sprigionano minerali di morte, liane pendenti, nero verde rosso, una dipartita di foglie, un che di alato, anelli di molecole, dalla luce zucchero. That's it. Please read the books, they're really, really worth it.
Yes, this one, unfortunately, it's not available for sale, but because it's a positive thing, it has been completely sold out,
Oh, really?
so they are reprinting it, but they weren't ready. They weren't ready yet, so, but I don't know.
They will be.
They will be, yeah,
Okay,
they will
so
be,
just-
but just, yeah, I don't know, you can see.
Thank you very much.